Hello, and thank you very much for the opportunity to talk to you tonight about something that's called heading for extinction and, in brackets, what we can do about it. The in bracket stuff, of course, is very, very, very important. Thank you very much for the invite to be here. Kira, thank you very much for organising this at the Launder building in Creekside, so thank you very much, except I would rather not be here. I mean, I really would rather not be here, and I wish that, Kira, there was no reason for you to call me to be here tonight to talk about, well, frankly, this horrible subject. But thank you for doing that, because this horrible subject is also a really, really, really important subject. Before we begin, or rather as we begin, can I introduce you to that date, 1990? We'll come back to that and why it's significant a little bit later on, but 1990. So part one is gloomy. It's very gloomy, and it may well be that during this part of the presentation a number of emotions surface. You might feel scared in terms of what you're going to hear, maybe even panicky for yourself, panicky for your children, panicky for your grandchildren. You may feel frustrated that we've allowed this situation to go as far as it has. You might feel angry that we've allowed this situation to go as far as it has. Maybe even, I don't know, rage that we've allowed this situation to go as far as it has. You might feel numb. You might feel sad because of some of this material. You might, in fact, grieve as a consequence of some of this material. Grieve for what we've lost. Grieve for what we will definitely lose. And grieve for what we might lose if we don't do something about this. But there's two emotions that I do not want to be in the room, and one emotion is helplessness, and the other emotion is hopelessness, because we are not helpless, we are not hopeless. Together we have a voice, together we can do something about this, and together actually we are doing something about this. I'm here because, well, I'm going to tell the truth. Not my truth, by the way, the scientific truth. The truth about the situation that we are in. And then I'm actually going to encourage you to act as though that truth is real. In other words, do something about it. That's pretty much part two, by the way. I bet you've seen and came across, well, because you see, our world, our planet, the only world in the universe that we know can harbour life, the pale blue dot, as Carl Sagan calls it, well, it's in crisis. And the crisis it's in is actually twofold. It's in a climate crisis, and it's in an ecological crisis. The world is warming up, and life is dying out. And actually, the climate crisis is affecting the ecological crisis, and the ecological crisis is affecting the climate crisis. They are, if you like, two sides of the same sword, or two sides of the same chainsaw. I bet you would have come across headlines like this quite recently, maybe the end of last year. We have 12 years to limit climate change catastrophe, warns the United Nations. Now, those headlines and headlines like them came out in October last year because these people, the IPCC, the Intergovernmental Panel on Climate Change, wrote a report, and that report was Special Report 1.5. To put that in a bit of context, 3 years before, our country and virtually every country in the world signed up for something called the Paris Agreement. I bet that you've heard about it, right? And as signatories to the Paris Agreement, our country and every country in the world that signed up for the Paris Agreement agreed to strengthen our response against the threat of climate change by holding the increase in global temperatures to 2 degrees Celsius, while at the same time pursuing efforts to limit it to 1.5 degrees Celsius. Now, back then, they didn't really know what the difference was between 1.5 degrees Celsius and 2 degrees Celsius in terms of the impact on our world. So they tasked scientists to find out. And the results of that finding out, well, that was Special Report 1.5, and there it is. And I'm going to share with you their main conclusions. What they said was this. They said 2 degrees Celsius against pre-industrial levels is much, much, much worse for millions upon millions of people on this planet, and indeed for the other species we share this planet with. Oh yeah, and that we must limit global warming to 1.5 degrees Celsius. That's not safe. That's still catastrophic, but it's far less catastrophic than 2 degrees Celsius. We're still going to lose 70 to 90% of our coral reefs, for instance, at 1.5 degrees Celsius. Which means, well, we can't dig up any new fossil fuels. Even if we know it's in the ground, we can't dig it up, and we can't go looking for any new stuff either, because there's a carbon budget and we are severely overspent. Oh yeah, and despite the headlines, 12 years to save the planet, of course it's 11 years now to save the planet, well, there's no time to lose. We must act now. Why? Because, well, we're going to reach 1.5 degrees Celsius against pre-industrial levels somewhere between 2030 and 2052. Oh yeah, and not only that, current pledges are insufficient. So all those countries that signed up for the Paris Agreement, their pledges, if they were realised, and there's no guarantees that they will be, but if they committed to their pledges, if those pledges became a reality, we're still going to hit 3 degrees Celsius against pre-industrial levels. So the science is clear. The scientists themselves, of course, are clear. This is Deborah Roberts. She's the co-chair of the Impacts Committee. That is the committee that wrote the report. She says, we must act now. This is the largest clarion bell from the science community. And I hope it mobilizes people and dents the mood of complacency. This is Eric Solheim. He's the executive director of the United Nations Environment Programme, the sort of parent body of the IPCC. He says of the report, it's like a deafening, piercing smoke alarm going off in the kitchen. We have to put out the fire. And this is Professor Schellnhuber. He's a climatologist. He's actually the founder of the Potsdam Institute of Climate Impact Research. He says climate change is now reaching the end game. The issue is the very survival of our civilization. So the scientists are clear, the science is clear. But nevertheless, I want to talk to you about some science. I want to talk to you specifically about temperature. I want to talk to you about something called feedback loops, and I want to talk to you about tipping points. Now, currently, the temperature is about 1 to 1.1 degrees Celsius above pre-industrial levels. That's where we are now. But you know that, don't you, actually? You don't need me to know it to tell you that. And you don't know it because you're climate scientists, though you might be, and if you are, forgive me, right? No, you know it because you are human beings alive in this world currently. That's why you know it. You remember, don't you, the forest fires that were in California last year? And the hurricanes that were along the east coast of America and in the Caribbean, and maybe also too the forest fires that were in the north of Sweden in the Arctic Circle. And you might remember too the moorland in Yorkshire catching fire, and then catching fire again, and then catching fire again, and then catching the fire again. Oh, and you might remember the torrential rain that we've had, well, in China, in Japan, and of course in Kerala with the floods there. And you do know all those sorts of things, and you know, don't you, that the world is warming up because you just kind of experience it. You know that we've kind of got, I don't know, unseasonable weather. And you're right, it is warming up. In fact, right, 20 of the last 22 years on record have been the warmest years on record, globally. Oh, and you know why it's warming up too, don't you? Yeah, it's because we keep on putting CO2 into the atmosphere at an ever-increasing rate. So yeah, that's where we are now, and well, we're going to hit 1.5 about 2040 according to that trajectory. But you know what? 1.5, 1 degrees, that doesn't sound much. Even 1.5 all the way back to pre-industrial levels, it doesn't sound much. That's a degree and a half, that's all it is. I mean, there's a bigger differentiation between night and day. And we survive going to bed every night, don't we, right? So, well, it can't be that bad. Well, of course, 1.5 is the global average. Here's a heat map. And on the heat map, you can see, like, well, splotches of blue. That's where it's cooling. And then you can see that everywhere else, it's heating up. And the darker the red, well, the faster it's heating up. So northern Canada, well, that's twice the global average. And in the Arctic, well, it's even faster than that. And then you get splotches of blue, like this splotch of blue here under Greenland next to the UK in the North Atlantic. It's cooling down there. And the reason why it's cooling down there is because ice in Greenland and the Arctic is melting. And it's cooling down the ocean. Sticking with the Arctic, actually, you know, don't you, in the Arctic, that there's sea ice. And in the winter, the sea ice is at its greatest extent, and in the summer it kind of retreats back. And it kind of breathes, in a sense, over the course of a season, do you know? Well, that line of retreat, that extent of retreat, has gone back further and further and further as the years have gone by. Watch this. So that's where we are now, 4.6 million square kilometers of Arctic sea ice in the summer. They do this measurement, by the way, in September. September is when you're at the warmest in the Arctic. That's a month before, by the way, they published Special Report 1.5. So that's where it is now, 2018. And if I go back to 1980, well, it's not 4.6 million square kilometers, it's 7.7 million square kilometers. Now don't look at the numbers, right? Just look at the kind of splodgy bit there in the middle. There's the Arctic sea ice. That's where it was in 1980. Keep a look at that. And here it is now. And in fact, it's predicted that we're going to lose Arctic summer sea ice, well, in the 2050s. It's not my prediction, by the way. That's the prediction of the UK Parliament. Their Environmental Audit Committee predict that it's going to be the 2050s. As it is, it might be actually sooner than that. And the reason why it might be sooner than that is because it's very difficult to factor in something called feedback loops. You know this one. This is called the albedo effect. Now, you know that when you go into the sun, right, and you're wearing a black t-shirt, you kind of get hotter, don't you, right? But if you're wearing a white t-shirt, well, that white t-shirt reflects the sun's rays back out, and you're not so hot. Well, the same thing happens with any black or white surface on the planet. For instance, the North Pole, Arctic sea ice, and dark oceans. And it causes a feedback loop. It works like this. So you get a temperature rise. As a consequence of that, Arctic sea ice melts, and therefore, well, there's less reflection from the white ice and more absorptions of the sun rays, the heat, into the dark oceans, which causes a temperature rise. Arctic sea ice melts, you get less reflection, more absorption, and so on. Here's another one. You get a temperature rise. You get forest dieback. In other words, the forests just die. As a consequence of that, there's less CO2 being absorbed because there's less trees to absorb that CO2. That's what trees do. They absorb CO2. So you get a temperature rise. You get more forest dieback. You get less CO2 absorbed. Here's another one. You get a temperature rise and you get forest fires. As the forests dry out, they catch fire. This, by the way, is a picture of the Amazon. So you get forest fires, which means now you've got less CO2 absorbed because there are less trees to absorb that CO2. And in fact, more CO2 is being released because those trees are on fire and sending the CO2 up, which means that you get more of a temperature rise, more forest fires, less CO2 absorbed, more CO2 released. Here's another one. You get a temperature rise. And you get more water vapor in the atmosphere. Now, the thing is, water vapor absorbs heat because it is a greenhouse gas. It stops the heat going out into space. So now you get a temperature rise, more water vapor in the atmosphere, water vapor absorbs heat, and so on. Oh, and here's another one. You get a temperature rise. Arctic permafrost melts. Therefore, CO2 is released, but also methane is released. And methane is 28 times more potent than CO2. So you get a temperature rise, Arctic permafrost melts, more CO2, methane is released, and there's gigatons of that stuff, methane, in the permafrost. Oh, here's another one. You get a temperature rise and you get more use of fans and air conditioners. It sounds a little bit trite, doesn't it? Really? Well, you go to any slightly warm country and you see how many fans and air conditioners they're using. And because you've got more use of fans and air conditioners, well, guess what? More energy consumption. And that energy consumption is inevitably more fossil fuels. So you get more of a temperature rise, more use of fans and air conditioners, more energy consumption, and so on. Oh, yeah. And all those feedback loops can work together. They're not in isolation. So perhaps then we, as a global community, should work together to do something about it, should be cooperating to do something about it. But in a changing world with more climatic pressures, with less resources, maybe you're not going to get cooperation. Maybe what you're going to get actually is competition between countries. Maybe actually you're going to get a move towards popularism, a move towards nationalism. Maybe there's going to be tensions between countries. Maybe there's going to be conflict between countries. Maybe in fact there's going to be war between countries. Certainly the IPCC say if we carry on business as usual, in other words do nothing, risks include high levels of public unrest and political destabilization due to the increasing climatic pressures resulting in some countries becoming dysfunctional. I feel like I could make a little cheap joke there, but I won't. Or which means that this place here, the United Nations, well, maybe that becomes the disunited nations. And that's a feedback loop too, by the way. We get a temperature rise, which means we get more populism, nationalism, tensions, conflict, war, which means, well, there's more competition between nations now, less collaboration. So you get a temperature rise, more populism, nationalism, tensions, conflict, war, more competition, less collaboration, and so on. And whilst that's happening, the temperature keeps on going up. And it moves us ever closer to tipping points. Now, a tipping point has been defined by the IPCC as this, an abrupt and irreversible change in the climate system. An analogy that's sometimes used is something like this. You're chopping down a tree, so you chop and you chop and you chop and you chop, and it's still standing. So you chop and you chop and you chop, but it's still standing. So you chop and you chop and you chop and you chop, and it's still standing, right? And you chop and it falls. That's an abrupt and irreversible change. You can't put the tree back up again. Another analogy that's sometimes used is that of a ball that's running down the hill. If you're quick, you can run after that ball and stop that ball running any further. But if you leave it too long, well, the ball's going to keep on rolling and go down to the bottom of the hill, the next stable platform. So that's where we are now, currently 1 degree Celsius above pre-industrial levels, maybe a little bit over. And we are definitely going to get to 1.5 degrees Celsius. That's certain. And there's a very good chance, if we don't do something about this, acting now, that we're going to hit 2 degrees Celsius. In fact, remember those pledges? Even if those pledges are fulfilled, we're still going to hit 3 degrees Celsius. Now, this is awful, 2 degrees Celsius, in its own right. And I'll explain why in a moment. But it's awful too because it might start triggering a cascade of tipping points. So then who knows where the ball finally ends up. Hands up if you would get on a plane and take a flight if you knew that there was a 1 in 20 chance that that plane would crash. No hands. Hands up if you would put your children on a plane if you knew that there was a 1 in 20 chance that that plane would crash. No hands. Hands up if you would put your no hands, right? And yet, according to this guy, Professor Ram Ramanathan of the Scripps Institute of Oceanography, there is a 5% chance, in other words, a 1 in 20 chance that we are going to hit 5 degrees Celsius against pre-industrial levels. And he doesn't mean because of the stuff that we are going to put into the atmosphere. No, he doesn't mean that. He means what's based on the atmosphere already. Current levels of CO2 might take us to 5 degrees Celsius. We're playing Russian roulette, aren't we? With our lives, our children's lives, our grandchildren's lives. And yet still we drill for more gas, still we drill for more oil, still we dig up coal, still we build those runways, still we drive our gas guzzling cars, still we tear down those ancient forests, still we burn them clear. Still, we're addicted to beef and dairy products, even though these animals farmed on an industrial scale, the digestive process of these animals itself contributes to CO2 levels, greenhouse gases, in terms of all the methane that's released. And still, we burn coal. Now, actually, coal use globally is on the decline. That's good news. But it's not in the decline in China or India. You know, the two countries in the world with the biggest populations. Yeah, it's not on the decline there. In fact, they're building new generation coal-powered fire stations. And those coal-powered fire stations aren't going to be around for a year or 2 years or even 5 years. No, they're going to be around for decades, pumping the CO2 up into the atmosphere. Oh, and still we pump CO2 up into the atmosphere. Last year, it went up by 2.7%. In fact, in January, February, March, in April this year, for the first time ever, we reached, in terms of CO2 concentration levels, 415 parts per million. First time recorded history that we've ever done that. The last time that concentration levels were this high, well, that was 3 million years ago. Global temperatures were 3 to 4 degrees hotter than they are now, and water levels, sea levels, were between 10 and 20 meters higher than they are now. Let's go back to this image. This image reminds me of that story of King Sisyphus. Do you know that story of King Sisyphus? Ancient Greek myth. Well, there it is. King Sisyphus, he believed that he was more clever than the gods themselves, right? More clever, in fact, than Zeus. He was full of conceit, well, there you are, but also full of deceit. And he tried to trick the gods. He tried to manipulate them. He would lie to them to get what he wanted. Well, the gods found out, and he was punished. And his punishment, right, was this, that he had to, for eternity, roll a boulder up a hill. And as this boulder got just to the summit, just before the summit, the boulder would roll all the way back again. And he'd have to start all over again for eternity. Now, I think that actually we're a little bit like King Sisyphus. I think as a species, not as individuals, but as a species, we're full of conceit and deceit. I think that we are more clever than Mother Nature, that we have Mother Nature under our control, and boy, there's been deceit. Deceit from politicians, deceit from business leaders, deceit from lobbyists, do you know? Lots of deceit. But there's a difference, though, between us and King Sisyphus. At least King Sisyphus will be able to move the boulder. We won't. Once that abrupt and irreversible change has happened, it stays that way forever. We will have weaponized the climate against us and against life on this planet. The world will be completely different. But that's not where we are at. We are there. And we're definitely going to hit 1.5 degrees Celsius, and if we don't do anything about it, 2. And remember those pledges, well, that takes us to 3. Well, let's have a look. 1 degree Celsius, 3 degrees Celsius. At between 1 degree Celsius and 3 degrees Celsius against pre-industrial levels, the Greenland ice sheet is going to melt. The Arctic summer sea ice is going to retreat to nothing. Alpine glaciers are going to melt away. In fact, we're going to lose 50% of alpine glaciers by 2050 and 75% by the end of the century, the 2100s. And there's nothing that we can do about it. Even if we stop putting CO2 up into the atmosphere now, we put so much momentum into the kind of temperature that it's going to happen. Imagine you're driving down the road, right? And you put your car in neutral, well, your car still keeps on going forward, doesn't it? Well, the same with temperature. There's nothing we can do about that. And at between 1 to 3 degrees Celsius against pre-industrial levels, we're going to lose our coral reefs. Oh yeah, and the West Antarctic ice sheet is going to melt. And those feedback loops and those tipping points are going to put us closer to more feedback loops and more tipping points, including those happening between 3 and 5 degrees Celsius above pre-industrial levels. Let's just look at just one of those, and that's the Amazon rainforest. Between 3 and 5 degrees Celsius, well, that's going to dry out. In fact, right, you're going to get forest dieback and it's going to burn. And eventually, the rainforest is going to stop being a rainforest and it's going to turn into savanna, grassland. The great carbon sink, no, it's going to become grassland. And that's going to take us, well, to 5 and above. And at 5 above, well, we are going to lose our Arctic winter sea ice. And at the other side of the planet, the East Antarctic ice sheet is going to melt. Oh yeah, and all that permafrost is going to melt, with all the CO2 that's contained within it and all the methane that's contained within it. Yeah, quick question. I'm going to show you some cities, right? And what I want you to do, they're from cities in the UK, is if you can, work out what the connection is between these cities, right? As soon as you see the connection, shout out what that connection is. You won't be rude, it's absolutely fine, I'm encouraging you to do this. So what's the connection, right, between these cities here? Aberdeen, Belfast, Brighton, Bristol, Cardiff, Dundee. They're all on the sea, which is why they should be declaring a state of emergency. All those cities there are by the coast, by the sea, or they are on rivers, tidal rivers, right? Let's go back to Greenland and Antarctica. As you know, the ice on Greenland and Antarctica is sitting on land. So when that melts, that ice is going to go into the oceans, into the seas, and it is melting, by the way. Greenland is melting 5 times faster than it was 25 years ago. And Antarctica, well, it's 3 times faster than it was 25 years ago. Which means that the people who are living here, Aberdeen, Belfast, Brighton, Bristol, Cardiff, Dundee, Edinburgh, Glasgow, Hull, London, and all low-level areas within the UK, including, well, lots of East Anglia, are going to have to move. In fact, it turns out that 1/3 of the UK's population lives within 5k of the coast. Let's stick with London just for a second. Here's London. This is London at 2 degrees Celsius. Let's have some well-known landmarks. So there we are. There's the Houses of Parliament. Oh, and here's the O2 building, the Millennium Dome. Oh, and there we are, the Laban building. Bring your wellies at 2 degrees Celsius. Here it is at 4 degrees Celsius. Bring a canoe. I have a question. Oh yeah, okay, here's the question. What's the global population now? Does anyone know what the current global population is? It doesn't matter. I'll tell you. The global population currently is 7.7 billion. When I was 5, in 1970, it was half of that. Or to put it another way, since 1970, it's doubled. And it's projected to hit 10 billion in the 2050s, 2056 according to the United Nations' own projections. Well, where will all those people live? Well, they're going to live where they live now. There's just going to be a lot more urban sprawl. So they'll be living, actually, on the coast. This is the 2050s, global populations along the coast. The red dots, well, that's global population, that's urban populations of 10 million or more, so at least 10 million. The orange, that's between 5 and 10 million, and the green, that's 1 million to 5 million. I'm going to count up the red, right? That's at least the 10 million. So we have 10, 20, 30, 40, 50, 60, 70, 80, 90, 100, 110, 120, 130, 140, 150, 160, 170, 180, 190, 200. There's 200 million people at least living by the coast. I've not looked at the orange and I've not looked at the green. And you will notice, won't you, that most of those people are living in the global south. You know, that bit of the world which is least responsible for putting the least amount of CO2 up into the atmosphere. But they're the people that are going to be affected first and affected most severely. I mean, don't worry, it's coming our way. Or rather, worry, it's coming our way. But they're going to be affected first. There's a sense here, isn't there, of climate injustice? Oh, and as they get up and move and go inland because of those rising sea levels, the people that are inland, particularly in the center of continents, well, it's going to be too hot there, so they're going to move towards the coast. In fact, it's going to be so hot in the center of those continents that the seeds that we plant now for our food won't germinate, or at least many of them won't. Oh, and this tropical area, yeah, it's all going to be too hot. People won't be able to live there either. About 3 years ago, as you'll remember, we had the Syrian conflict, a nasty, brutal conflict. It resulted in 11 million refugees, 11 million people being made homeless. The majority of those, well, 6 million were in Syria, displaced in Syria. 5 million were displaced outside of Syria. 1 million of those 5 million came to Europe. We didn't do very well with it, did we? We weren't very welcoming, were we? We didn't show our best side, did we? In fact, maybe that in part explains the move towards populism that's been seen in Europe, nationalism that's been seen in Europe. But that was 1 million refugees. The World Bank estimates that by the 2050s, there's going to be 140 million refugees, 140 million people up and on the move. The United Nations say, well, it might be as high as 1 billion. That's 1 in 10 of the global population on the move. Oh, and while they are on the move, there's still going to be storms and cyclones and hurricanes. But those cyclones and hurricanes are going to be much more frequent and much more severe. Oh yeah, and there's going to be storm surges, of course, and floods. Oh, and rain, I mean torrential rain, because remember the water vapor, it's holding all that water now. It's got to come down at some point. And the paradox is, despite there being a lot of water, there's also going to be a lot of droughts. And heat. And heat waves. It's a misnomer, heat waves. The idea of a wave suggests movement, doesn't it? But no, a heat wave is where heat just settles in one area and doesn't move. Oh, and it kills because it settles in one area. Oh, and forest fires, and desertification, and crop failure, and famine, and disease, and unrest, and I'm sorry. I'm sorry because we're going to experience that, and I'm sorry because we already are. It's just that it's going to get a lot worse. I said it was gloomy, didn't I? Of course, we're not the only species on this planet. There are other species too. You would have come across this, I'm sure you have. Something called the background extinction rate. Now, according to the background extinction rate, it's going to happen anyway. It's a sort of prediction of evolution that since 1900, we should have lost, well, 1.26 mammals. That is, well, let's round it down, 1 mammal. And since 1900, we should have lost 2.38, well, 2.5 birds, and 1 reptile, and 1.5 amphibians, and 2.5 fish. That's what was expected. However, what's been observed is very different. Since 1900, well, actually, we've lost 69 mammal species, 80 bird species, 24 reptiles, 146 amphibians, 158 fish. So not 9, but 468. Oh, and that's highly conservative too, because that's only the known extinctions, not the ones that we don't know anything about, only the ones that we know something about. The authors of the report describe this rate of extinction as biological annihilation. It's a good phrase for it, isn't it? I can think of another one though. The one that I use is Anthropocene. Anthropos, human, scene, epoch. This is the new human epoch. And we are driving, well, the climate, we are driving geology, we are driving the direction of evolution, we are driving extinctions. I bet you come across this, the red list. I bet you have. Now, the red list sort of assesses species, and it assesses about 100,000 species. And on the red list, of this 100,000, 27,000 are at risk of extinction, including this one. This is the greater mascarene flying fox, a native of Mauritius. There it is again. What a beautiful photograph. I'd quite happily have this on my wall, by the way. I think that's just really beautiful. Oh, and here it is, look, oh, having some lunch. And that's the problem, actually, having lunch, because it eats fruit. And the fruit farmers in Mauritius have lobbied the government to cull the numbers of this particular mammal. Now, it was already on the vulnerable list, but now it's on the endangered list. And that's just one of 27,000 animals in Mauritius. You know Mauritius, the land of the dodo. Here's another one. This is the Jamaican hutia, a sort of rodent, a type of guinea pig. Small population in Jamaica. It's getting smaller because, well, where it lives, now people have moved out to that area and they're building. So its territory is now fragmented. It's difficult to mate for the animal. And in fact, it's got risk from predation from dogs and from cats. And that's just one more of the 27,000 species that are at risk of extinction. Oh, and here's another one. The black spider monkey, the largest primate in South America. It lives north of the Amazon. Actually, particularly intelligent primate too. It's been assessed as it's quite an intelligent primate. I suspect more intelligent than us because, well, it wouldn't do to the planet what we're doing. But its habitat has been cut down. So its territory is getting smaller. So now we're getting pockets of these animals and they're kind of genetically isolated now. Oh, and it's also being hunted for its meat. And that's just one of 27,000 species that are at risk of extinction. Oh yeah, and then we find another United Nations report, again by an intergovernmental panel, therefore the best scientists of the day looking at this. It turns out that actually 1 million species are at risk of extinction. That's too big to comprehend. I'm going to do my best. I'm going to use an analogy, right? So this is the Manchester United football ground. This is Old Trafford. It's the biggest Premiership football ground in the country. It holds 76,000 people. Imagine this. Imagine it full of people and you wipe them out. You kill them. And then next week you fill it up again and then wipe them out. And then next week you fill it up again and then you wipe them out. And you fill it up again and then you wipe them out. And then you fill it up again and you wipe it out. And you do that for 13 weeks. That's what 1 million looks like. And I'm talking about 1 million human beings here. But no, it's 1 million species that are at risk of extinction. And we've looked at 3. Those 3. 3 mammals. And sticking with mammals, by the way, it turns out, well, when we look at all the mammals, all the numbers of all the mammals, well, 60% of them are livestock. 36% of them are humans. And only 4% of them are wild mammals. This is heartbreaking. I could cry. And it's the same story if we look at birds. 70% of all birds, well, essentially are chicken, and one breed of chicken too. And 30% of wild birds. In fact, it's been suggested that if there are archaeologists sometime in the future, if anyone of them managed to survive this catastrophe, and they want to know when the Anthropocene era began, all they have to do is find anywhere on the globe, dig a hole and go down. And when they reach a layer of chicken bones, at the bottom of that layer, that's when the Anthropocene epoch began. Our world, this world, is having the life sucked out of it. In fact, we are in the 6th great extinction event. The one before the one that we are creating now. Well, that's the famous one. That's the one that wiped out the dinosaurs. It happened 65 million years ago. 76% of all species wiped out. The one before, in fact, the 4 before that, including the one that we are currently in now, all have high levels of CO2. The one before the one that wiped out the dinosaurs, well, that was 199 million years ago. The one before that, well, that was 251 million years ago. Before that, 364 million years ago. Before that, 439 million years ago. But I want to concentrate on this one here. This is called the End Permian Extinction Event, also known as the Great Dying. And it was a great dying too, because it wiped out 96% of all marine species and 70% of all land-based species. A report came out last year that was looking into why this might have happened. Here's the report. I'm going to share with you their conclusions. They said, well, this happened because CO2 was being released. Not by us, we weren't around, human beings weren't around then. No, it was being released by volcanoes. Which meant, right, that the temperature went up. CO2, greenhouse gas, bound to happen. So therefore the oceans warmed. Well, that makes sense because it's the oceans that take in most of the temperature that's in the atmosphere. And because they're warming and because CO2 is going into the oceans, well, we had ocean acidification, which means that the marine life died, including phytoplankton. Now, phytoplankton do for the oceans and the atmosphere what plants on Earth, on land do. That is, they create, produce oxygen. But now oxygen is going down. So actually what we had was marine life dying. Oh, and land-based creatures dying. And the authors of this report state rather archly that perhaps we should be wise to take note, because these environmental and ecological adaptations are the predicted consequences of our own climate and the ecological crisis. Oh yeah, worldwide 6% of all vertebrate animals have been wiped out since 1970. Now that's not in terms of numbers of actual numbers of animals here. What it is, it's the average of all the species put together. So it may well be for some vertebrates it's 80%, for other vertebrates it's 40% wiped out, but the average put together is 60%. Nevertheless, right, 60% of vertebrates wiped out. Well, that causes this man here, Mike Barrett of the WWF, to say, if we were talking about human beings being wiped out at that scale, it would be equal to emptying North America, South America, Africa, Europe, China, and Oceania, Australasia. We would know that was happening. We would rightly mourn it. But my suspicion is that most people walking down the street are not even aware of this. The habitats that are most severely affected, well, actually that's freshwater habitats. There it's 83% of all species put together are being wiped out. And globally, well, where is it worse effects? Well, as you know, it's South America and Central America, with the Far East, places like Indonesia and Borneo not being far behind. And we know why, don't we, too? Yeah, it's so that we can have cattle, where once there were rainforests. And if it's not cattle, well, it's palm oil. It looks quite lush, this, doesn't it? It looks quite lovely. But actually, that's green culture, green monoculture. That's green concrete. There's nothing else growing there apart from palm oil, palms. Oh, did I say cattle and palm oil? Did I say cattle and palm oil? Forgive me, I don't mean that. No, that's not actually the crop that they're interested in. The crop that they're interested in is that one there. That's the crop. Do you know that song, Money Makes the World Go Round? Money makes the world go round. What is it? It goes, a mark, a yen, a buck or a pound, a mark, a yen, or a buck or the pound. It makes the world go round. Well, there's an updated version of that. It's not as catchy. but it's true. It goes like this. It goes a euro, a yen, a buck or a pound. A euro, a yen, a buck or a pound leads to irreversible climate change, destruction of ecosystems, and mass extinctions. It's not as catchy, is it? That's true. But it's okay because, well, GDP goes up. In fact, yearly GDP goes up by 3%, which means, well, in 24 years it doubles. And as it doubles, the natural world gets smaller and smaller and smaller. And as we tear down our ancient forests and burn them clear to put our palm oil and our cattle on it, our cash crops really, well, the CO2 that's released accounts for almost a third of all the CO2 that's in the atmosphere. Deforestation. So my feeling is that this place, our home, the only home that we know of that we can live, the only place that we know of in the known universe that supports life, I think it needs protecting. I think it needs a shield placed over it. And it's for us to do it. Oh yeah, and who knew, right? So we get also land degradation. In other words, the fertility of the soil beneath our feet, well, it's dying. 40 years, according to Michael Gove in the UK, that's it, won't be able to grow anything. 60 years globally. And if that's not enough existential threat for you, what about we're losing our insects? And insects, of course, are right at the bottom of the food chain, and there are pollinators. And we're connected to this natural world, and this natural world is connected to us. And we're killing it off. Which causes this man here, Professor Ehrlich, to say, in pushing other species to extinction, humanity is busy sawing off the limb on which it perches. Oh, so how are we doing in the UK? Well, actually, in the UK, we're not doing that good at all. No, we're killing our insects too. Yeah, we are. Oh yeah, and we're going to miss almost all of our 2020 nature targets. Yeah. And oh yeah, 1 in 10 of our wildlife species faces extinction. 1 in 5 mammals faces extinction in the UK. Oh yeah, and we're going to carry on with fracking. That's government policy, even though a report suggests that it's going to release as much CO2 as nearly 300 million cars. Oh yeah, and we've just commissioned a deep coal mine, exactly the thing that we need to do at this moment in this climate and ecological emergency. While at the same time, we've cut subsidies on solar panels. Oh yeah, and we're going to build that third runway. Government policy. Makes Heathrow the most polluting corner of the UK. Look at the placards here. No climate wrecking third runway, because that's what it is. It's a climate wrecking third runway. I want our government to be at the forefront of fighting the climate emergency, doing something about this, but no, we're part of the problem. You can download this for yourself. This is a bit of good news. Well, it's always good to have a little bit of good news. This is from the National Statistics Office, and it shows 2017 UK greenhouse gas emissions. And this is the bit that I want you to focus on. So here's the good news. Looking at the light blue, well, it turns out, right, that since the light blue, by the way, is all greenhouse gases combined, well, since 2016 to 17, there's been a 3% reduction year on year. And 1990 to 2017, that means there's been a 42% reduction in all greenhouse gases. Fantastic, good news, well done UK. And if we look at the dark blue, well, that's just CO2. So 2016, 2017, a 3% decrease. Well, that's good news. And 1990 to 2017, a 37% decrease in CO2 levels. Well done us. But these statistics don't take into account aviation. No, it's not in the stats. A quick question for you. Which country is responsible for the most airline flights? You're going to say the UK, right, because we were talking about the UK. No, it's not the UK. It's actually America. Well, that makes sense because America is a big country, right? With lots of people, they're bound to take flights. So which country after America is the country that's most responsible for the most airline flights? You're going to say the UK, right, because we were talking about the UK. But no, it's not the UK. It's actually China. So which country after China is responsible for the most airline flights? Well, you're going to say UK, aren't you, because we were talking about the UK, and it is. Yeah, little Earth. Third country most responsible for airline flights. And those stats do not take into account aviation. And those stats, too, do not take into account shipping. And I bet it has not escaped your notice that we are an island. But it doesn't take into account shipping. In fact, 90% of all goods are shipped. Doesn't take into account. So I'm beginning to wonder, really, whether those stats are reliable, do you know? In fact, they're not. It turns out that it's not a 37%, looking at carbon dioxide here, CO2, reduction since 1990. No, it's 10%. And it's not 3% a year. No, it's 0.4% a year since 1990. Oh, yeah, and it wasn't because of climate change or climate emergency, none of that stuff. No, it was because, well, here we are. Reduced emissions mainly due to a decrease in the use of coal for electricity generation. And that was prompted by EU laws about having clean air, not about the climate and ecological emergency. There's that phrase, I bet you know it. It goes, lies, damn lies, I know how it finishes, just give me a second. Oh yeah, and creative accounting. And given that we're talking about accounting, let's stick with that theme. What about the UK's carbon debt? We were the first country in the world to industrialise. How much of that CO2 up there, those greenhouse gases up there, are ours? Do you recall this? You can just about see it. This is the opening shot of David Attenborough's Climate Change, The Facts. Can you just see it, right? Well, the researcher for this particular program was called Liv Grant. And she was tasked, she had 4 months to do this, to go around the world to get the climate change, the climate emergency stories that would be best for, well, for audiences to be aware of, so that the narrative, the truth, the message of climate change, the climate emergency was got across. And she was interviewed actually after this program was aired. And I'm going to share with you some of the things that she said. She said this. She said, of those 4 months, I spoke to scientists who described the so loud it gives you whiplash crack of a glacier carving off the Greenland ice shelf. Another told me of the horror he felt when his calculations revealed that the current logging and burning of tropical forests releases more carbon dioxide than our remaining forests could possibly absorb. I read detailed and disturbing death threats sent to climate activists to make them go quiet. I listened to people who have lost their homes and heritage to rising sea levels. I watched countless videos of wildfires ripping through suburbia. And cannot forget the little girl's voice in the background of one shaky mobile phone recording, asking her daddy if she was going to catch fire. Still, the most upsetting videos I saw were of politicians and pundits spreading harmful lies, promoting their own interests at the cost of protecting children from climate change. It was a privilege to hear these stories, but I struggled to cope with what I learned. Climate anxiety, as I think of it, crept into my mind and body and settled as an incoherent anger. Have you come across this phrase, Earth Overshoot Day? I suspect you have, but I'm going to give you the definition anyway. Earth Overshoot Day marks the date when humanity's demand for ecological resources and services in a given year exceeds what Earth can regenerate in that year. In other words, right, so look, back in 1969, you can't see it, but there it is, bottom left, we were using about 1 Earth in 1 year. But as the years have marched on, well, we're using up Earth's resources earlier and earlier in the year. In fact, now we're using up Earth's resources globally as an average in August the 1st. So to put it another way, not 1 Earth 1 year, no, 1.7 Earths 1 year. And like I say, that's the global average. Country by country, it's different. So there you are, there's the United States. Well, they use 5 Earths in 1 year. And there we are, the UK, at the bottom of this particular list, 2.9 Earths in 1 year. But our government and the governments before us are proud of our record on dealing with the climate and ecological emergencies. France isn't far behind us, and there's India. And in this particular list, India is the only country that's below 1 Earth per year. But I wonder whether it's going to stay this way. India has a lot of poor people, of course, doesn't it? And those poor people in India, I can imagine that they would want lives like the people in the global north have had, or maybe that their own middle classes have had. I see this only going one way unless we do something about it. "1990, remember that date? Right at the beginning I said? Well, it turns out that 1990 was the year that the first IPCC report was published. There it is, 1990. And it contained dire warnings from the world's best and leading climate scientists back then that we absolutely must keep global temperature increases to 1 degree Celsius. We must. Last year we had Special Report 1.5, there it is, and it contained dire warnings from the world's leading climate scientists that we absolutely must keep global temperature rise to 1.5 degrees Celsius. We don't have a good track record, do we? Well, the first IPCC report was published in 1990. Which means, right, that in 1990 we knew there that the temperature was going up, but still it went up. It means, right, in 1990 we knew there that we were overshooting on our ecological budget, but still we overshoot with increasing speed. And that we knew there that we were putting CO2 into the atmosphere, and indeed we continue to do so at ever increasing rates. It causes this man here, David Wallace Wells, author of The Uninhabitable Earth, to say, we have now engineered as much ruin knowingly as we ever managed in ignorance. These people knew in 1990, or rather the predecessors of these people, and they did their duty and they told these people. And these people, well, told these people. So we knew. But still the emergency got worse. Still the situation became ever increasingly dire. So my view is this. We need to do something about this. We need a rebellion. We need an extinction rebellion.